In the previous episode, we looked at the Velomobile after 28.5 thousand kilometers. I showed how the windows, visors, lights, mirrors and other parts were built. I also showed the wear of most of the components and outlined the problems with water getting inside. I accidentally dropped the Velomobile and broke the mirror. I also found aluminium dust inside the brake drum. Well, before fixing anything, I decided to wash it. I have never done this before. Hope I didn't make it worse. And here is the water everywhere. Of course. Ho ho. This is fun. I have never done anything like this before. Well, after everything was washed, it already looks much better. I am worried about electronics, so I need to dry it out. To do this, I will put power source inside. The first thing I need to dry is this electric box. And this is my 36 volt connector. Very reliable. I will have to sacrifice some electricity, but 1 kilowatt should be enough. 2 will be overkill. There we go. Hopefully it will dry out. While it's drying here, I will tell you how this Velomobile was built. This project started back in 2021, before the war in Ukraine. An American guy named Jason Dubin contacted me and offered to develop a Velomobile for sale in USA. He was going to handle sales and I was supposed to build the vehicle. He sponsored me so I could work on the Velomobile full time. It was exactly the lifestyle I wanted, developing a Velomobile and getting paid for it. We made pretty good progress. I created a 3D model, not as detailed as current one, but it was good enough. We ran virtual aerodynamic tests and I was able to make the molds and even the first body shell. Since it was planned for sale, not for just my personal use, we decided to make the XL version, which is obviously way too big for me. But then the war started. Shortly after, because my wife, who is a Russian citizen, wasn't allowed to back in Ukraine, I had to leave the country and abandoned my workshop. Eventually we ended up in Ireland, and if anyone's wondering where my kids were, they went to Poland with their mother. It was August 2022. We were still living in the first house we stayed at in Ireland. Dwayne Phillips took us in. Huge thanks to him. That's where I first saw the WOW Velomobile and got to ride it. I also rode the Pima bike that Dwayne let me use to commute to work. I had my first improvised workshop here, basically outdoors. But for summer it wasn't bad. My friend Jascha Beutler from Germany delivered the molds to me, and Jason paid for the shipping. He brought them from Ukraine all the way to Ireland. Thanks to that, I could start working. First I had to open the molds, clean them, and apply a release layer, in my case polyvinyl alcohol, Then wait for it to dry. The weather was okay, but I still had to constantly watch for the rain. As soon as clouds appeared, I had to hide everything. And at night I need to cover it all up. The next day, once it's dry, I applied the gel coat, the first colored layer. After it cured, I started to preparing to lay the reinforcement layers. But first I had to make a sun tent, because direct sunlight would hit the surface too much, and resin would cure before I could apply it. So I built this roof tent. Then I cut the fiberglass cloth, prepared the resin, mixed it with the hardener, and started laying it up. Using a brush, I applied at least 2 layers, more in the overlaps, of course. When it had cured enough, I could join all the molds parts together and see how it looks from inside. The day before, I had made a test piece of the same fiberglass, 2 layers. It turned out pretty strong. You can break it by hand, but the best part is that even when cracked, it stays held together. That helped me a lot later, very important in crashes. Next step was to join the 2 halves of the body. I used glass mat instead of cloth to also reinforce the seams. Sometimes I could lay the mold on its side, much more comfortable. And here is what it looked like in the end. It was already a full cocoon. The next day I could remove the body from the molds. I used special expansion bolts. They pushed against blank spots instead of holes. When you tighten them, they separate the mold parts. It made disassembly much easier. But not everything went smoothly. The release agent didn't work perfectly in some places, so I had to use hammer and wedges. The body got bent in some places, especially here on the nose. There was a big dent. I thought it was ruined, but literally 5 minutes later it returns to almost perfect shape. That's the beauty of fiberglass. So now I had a finished body shell. I was really happy. And here is a new 3D model of how the Velomobile looks today, inside and outside. The next step was to add internal reinforcements because the shell was too flimsy. If you squeeze it with your hands, it would flex, and you definitely couldn't stop on the floor. The fiberglass was only about a millimeter thick. First I glued in a polyethylene foam inserts, just to support the fiberglass. Then I laid 2 layers of 400 grams per meter square glass mat. It created a kind of bridge. Once it cured, I could actually stand on it, even though the Velomobile was sitting on the foam blocks. It held me perfectly. To glue in the front bridge, I had to tilt Velomobile like this to reach inside. I used the same technique, polyethylene foam base with the fiberglass on top. Here is how the bridge looked from inside. Stiffness is increased a lot, but I placed it too far forward. It needed to be shifted back because it later limited pedal adjustment. The next day I had to glue in the part that replaced the air intake and serves as frame adapter inside. It's made of fiberglass. I've wrapped a 5-liter water bottle to shape it. To reach the nose from inside, I first had to cut out the front hatch with the angle grinder. Not very neatly. I originally planned to make the hatch removable. Now I could reach the nose, test fit the adapter, see where to trim it. Since I was working alone, I made this contraption with the rubber bands and sticks to hold the adapter while I was gluing it. I also added extra stripes along the hatch so I could close it later. True, I never actually used them for that. After 2 crashes, they broke off anyway. Here is how the body looks inside on sunny day. Quite cozy. Here are 3D models of some components. This is the rear swing arm. The blue part is the removable steel axle. White is the aluminum swing arm itself. Red are the bolts. Pay attention to the rear swing arm. There is a red shock absorber. I eventually replaced it with a longer one. Here is the current version. I didn't have my own welder, so I went to work on Saturday. This is my boss in Highland. He let me work on my project at the company. It was my first time welding aluminium. I just watched YouTube videos how to do this. Those are my first welds. They may look rough, but nothing has broken yet. Then I had to install this half-round pipe insert. I cut a slot and welded it in. The axle will go here. I test fitted the axle. Everything was good. I also welded in tubes in those holes, so the bolts wouldn't crush the main pipe. I was making a list of parts I need to make. This is the front frame where the bottom bracket will go, and this tube is for steering system, the handlebar and steering arm. Those sticking out bits that I welded nicely ended up being not necessary. Here is how the suspension was supposed to work. The upper tube gets glued into the body, and this is the steering. After finishing at workshop, I loaded everything into the Pima bike. I made a separate video about it, by the way. And this is the owner's dog. It turned out that buying all the parts separately was more expensive than just buying a cheap bike and stripping it. So that's what I did. Jason paid for it too. The rear wheel had to be cantilevered, so I had to take it apart. After disassembling the wheel, I replaced the hub with one that could take radial bearing and reassemble it. Originally I planned to mount the rear swing arm like this, but when I tried to fit it, there was not enough space. So I changed the approach. Instead of those brackets, I welded the threaded tubes and screwed in a spherical joint. This is the steering arm in the frame, and into this huge gap between these tubes I had to insert plastic bushings. The wheels and struts were sent from Ukraine by my brother to me. They were for my first Velomobile, and I had to modify the mounting joints for the steering rod. Now I had 3 wheels. I cut the bottom brackets out of the bike frame and adapted to mount on the tube inside the Velomobile. Here is the rear wheel with the swing arm. I packed everything and went back to the workshop early in the morning. I usually worked on Saturdays on my project. So, welding the tubes instead of the brackets to mount the rear swing arm. This will be the steering universal joint. All of this was done in pure technical creativity mode. I didn't have exact dimensions or precise drawing. I just had a rough idea of how it should work. Actually, I only didn't have exact dimensions for the steering universal joint itself. For the struts, I had precise measurements because that's a critical part. If you make them wrong, the Velomobile will not steer properly. I kept the struts still, more reliable. The bottom bracket could have been aluminium, but I only had the steel cap from the bike frame, so I made the whole unit steel. Then I had to enlarge the holes and cut the threads in them. I did the same with the steering universal joint, although I later changed it. The original design wasn't very reliable. I ended up putting bolts all the way through with the nuts on the other side. This is much more reliable. But the unit itself stays the same and still works today, even with the same plastic insert. The last part was the plastic bushings for the steering column. Even though they have a little play, the Velomobile had steered perfectly of over 3 years with no issues. At this point, I was getting closer to having a new Velomobile, because I had all key parts: rear swing arm, steering column, steering universal joint, and handlebar. Right now I couldn't assemble it because of the push inside, but it's easy to fix. Bottom bracket with the mounting plate underneath, rear axle with the derailleur, and 2 front struts with suspension. Then, at home, I assembled the steering column, steering arm, and universal joint. Drilled the mounting hole. Those will also be used for stabilizing rods. I made a jig to hold the tubes while I am cutting threads for the stabilizing rods. I used strong aluminum tubes for the steering rods because they need to be really tough and not bend on impacts, so the wheels stay parallel. Then I could take out the body and start installing those parts inside. It wasn't easy. I immediately realized that my main bottom bracket tube was too high. Because of that, the pedals were too close to the ceiling and my foot wouldn't fit. The struts were too tall, so I had to shorten them. But first I did a test fit to see what else needed to be changed. Here you can see the pedals are too close. The toe of the shoe catches the top. I didn't have time to be super precise with the hole position, so it came out pretty crooked. I had to re-drill several times and then fill the extra holes. This bolt that my thumb touches is for attaching the stabilizing rod inside the body. After shortening the struts, I could install them. Of course, I still had to figure out the exact length of the stabilizing and steering rods, but that was just a matter of technique. Test fitting the steering rod. I had to change the angle of the main bottom bracket tube. It needs to be straight. This wasn't even the last version, but the one before last. I took it to work, welded it, came home, installed it and realized it still needed to be lower. The Velomobile was starting to take shape. I wasn't sure about the longitudinal stabilizing rod yet, so I left it for later. The bottom bracket was still too high. I could already test the front suspension if I got inside. I could pedal, but toes of my boots were catching the front bar. The idler roller mount weren't well designed in 3D model, so I had to improvise a lot. I remade them several times until I got it right. This body was designed for a much taller person, but because of its shape, I couldn't just move the bottom brackets back. There will be just not enough space for the toys, so I had to shorten the cranks. I have read a lot that short cranks are better for Velomobile, but personally I disagree. Now it was time to install the rear swing arm. Its mount also wasn't detailed enough in the 3D model, so again I had to improvise. It turned out the wheel with swing arm simply will not fit through the opening, but I had to cut a wheel slot in the floor anyway. You can't just screw the mount to the thin floor, so I made those rails with welded studs that go into the spherical joints. That's how the swing arm is attached. Then I had to install the rear strut and glue in first bolt in, then glue in the support tube on top. I used a flashlight to see the spot. I missed several times. The light didn't help much. I had to drill a few times until I hit the right place. Then filled all extra holes. Once the rails were bolted on the floor, the Velomobile was finally standing on its 3 wheels. That was a big milestone. The suspension even works a little, even though nothing was glued yet, just bolted. I didn't film the actual gluing process, it was too awkward. But here is how it looked before gluing, and here is glued too. I also added extra reinforcement going down from the tube to spread the load. The steering mechanism started working. Now I could cut the service hatch and install the wheel to check how convenient it is. The sequence is: first insert the axle, then secure it into the swing arm, then the rear strut. It turned out that on the 3D model I didn't place the channel quite right. It should have been shifted more to the side, but there was nothing I could do anymore. I started making the rear wheel well. I didn't have 3D model for it at all. I made it from aluminium in pure technical creativity mode. No real plan. This approach has its charm, but accuracy isn't its strong point. I found a nice spot for the rear idler. It turned out well. The longitudinal stabilizing rod for the front suspension I made from 6mm steel threaded rod, passing through aluminum angles. The solution worked great and still does. There is only tensional load here, no compression, unlike the other rods. The seat mount from the 3D model was also completely unsuitable, too small contact area with the floor, so I made those rails instead. I also installed 250 watts torque motor and shortened cranks for about 145mm. I knew that the floor wasn't strong enough to mount the front idler directly on it. It also needed to be as far forward as possible without catching the steering mechanism. At first I tried to mount it on the seat, but eventually made this bracket because there was nowhere else. And you will see how the floor flexes while riding. In this point, the main structure of the Velomobile was complete. I didn't film how I made the roof. I made it from the trash bin. On the suspension you can see those orange foam rubber inserts. I was trying to copy European Velomobile solutions, but apparently used the wrong rubber. This little hatch was held on with Velcro and got lost. I later made another one from a white plastic bucket. From below you can see the grey tube. The lower chain goes under the floor because there wasn't enough space in the chain channel. Another modern mistake. Otherwise, the inside hasn't changed much. Here I showed the roof again. It slides forward. I didn't want a forward flipping roof like I have now, because it's get wet in the rain when you open it. But if it's not rigidly attached, the wind can't just blow it away, so it's better to have it securely fixed. I also had this front threshold that protected the steering mechanism, but I removed it very quickly, because it made it impossible to reach the steering for adjustment, and I needed to adjust a lot in the beginning. I didn't have long enough cables, so I joined two cables with this special cable connector. And here you can see how thin the shell is. It's almost translucent.